On one of the tapes from long ago, Jerry tells a story of how he's driving along in the car and he hears this voice that says, "Drive up onto the sidewalk." And he does that. And then a truck comes and crashes into the cars that didn't get that voice. And there are people killed, and he's survived through that. And hearing him tell the story, hearing a voice isn't something that's part of his normal thing. So I'm going to ramble a bit to get to the point here. That I'm having a situation where I consider I'm in a cycle of momentum that and recurring thoughts that aren't serving me, and I'm looking for those little keys, moment to moment. And so I recognize the butterfly or the bird or the sunrise or the sunset as those keys at times. I want to be better at being in the moment and finding those things in my environment that would allow me to counteract the momentum that I've built up that I'm not enjoying.
There are a number of things that we want to say to you. Most important, when you listen to someone else's rendition of receiving thought or impulse, it's always translated through your perception in a sort of distorted way. And so we would like to show you what we mean by saying, what if instead of hearing words, "drive it on the sidewalk," Jerry simply just had an impulse to drive it on the sidewalk. An impulse that he couldn't really explain, but an impulse that was so strong he couldn't deny it, and so he did it. And then after the fact, when everything piled up and all those people were negatively affected, then after the fact he realized that he'd received an impulse that was so strong that he knew for sure to drive it up on the sidewalk. And so he's actually acknowledging that he even heard someone say, "drive it up on the sidewalk." But the fact of the matter is, it was an impulse that he knew. Now, we want to tell you a little bit more about that story. Jerry spent a lot of time on the road. He was an entertainer, so he's on the road a lot. And he had many satisfying moments, but many not satisfying moments, because when you're out there in the world, there's plenty for you to see. And in those days, he didn't know so much about reaching for satisfaction. In other words, he was like most everybody else, just sort of taking life as it came. But as a result of that, he had created a vortex that was always calling him, like everyone. So the further version of that story is that the roads were not freeways in those days. It was 2 lanes of traffic coming toward each other. And so you had to wait for oncoming traffic before you could pass anything. And he was following along behind a pickup truck that had a backload. The whole back end was full of Boy Scouts. Now, Jerry had been a Boy Scout, and he knew what he thought being a Boy Scout meant. It meant being honorable, and it meant being praiseworthy, and it meant doing good deeds. But this group of Boy Scouts, they were in their uniforms. It was obvious to him that they were Boy Scouts, were throwing pop bottles out of the back of the truck at the cars behind them, trying to keep them at bay. And so Jerry was, needless to say, not in a satisfied state of mind, as these Boy Scouts that should be being good were being anything but good. And so as a result of these Boy Scouts, Jerry was not right behind them. The traffic had slowed way, way down. The Boy Scouts were the reason for the backlog, and they were also the reason that no one could get around anything. So Jerry, not knowing way back then the conversation that we were going to be having today, still found a way to turn that moment into something that was more satisfying for him. Because instead of deciding to be angry at the Boy Scouts, he decided, because he had no choice, that he was just going to have to kick back and accept it, and then find a way to be satisfied anyway. And in that sort of remarkable epiphany, he found alignment. And in that alignment, he found information and an impulse that then later led. What we're getting at here is when you care about how you feel, and satisfaction or alignment is your objective, and you have some experiences like that, where for whatever reason you know you're in alignment, and then you recognize that in alignment you received an impulse, and then the impulse led to something that was an obvious correlation between you and something working out well for you. This is how you gain your footing that helps you to eventually come to know that things are always working out for you. In other words, it just brings a level of trust and expectation that you can sort of put in the place of trying to think everything through. Are you following us a little bit? So now go back to your question, because we think that's a good framework for what's coming next.
So, yes. So my question was how to connect sort of in the now, in the moment, and perhaps despite some negative momentum that's going on already in my day, to look for that lighted path.
Well, here's the thing. You have to have shown yourself how you can achieve it when it's easy before you can do it when it's more difficult. That's why we're encouraging you to do it first thing in the day, and just note that before you've pushed the car down the hill, until you understand, till you've identified and isolated and accomplished a feeling of satisfaction. Because once you've done that, then in time, and far less time than you think, you'll be able to do it under any and all conditions. This is the exercise that Esther's putting herself to the test in all day, every day, by acknowledging what's satisfying and then finding something that isn't, and then doing her best to turn it into a satisfying thought before it's an event that she is now dealing with or coping with. If you wait for the momentum to have gotten greater from dissatisfaction all the way down into something where there's really something treacherous that's going on, it's much more difficult for you to detach yourself from the details of all of that and find clarity that will lead you to. You hear people talking about how their lives went into slow motion just at those moments when they really needed it to, and all kinds of things that ordinarily wouldn't have come into place. They were able to deal with things more incrementally. That's because they were in a place where they clicked in to that broader perspective and saw the current situation from the broader perspective's point of view. The simple thing is just practice it when it's easy, and then you'll be able to do it in situations that are not so easy. But the thing that's a little contradictory in that statement is that the more you practice it when it's easy, the less opportunity you'll have to practice it when it's hard, because you would have headed everything off that was hard when it was easy. So we can't really even answer the question because one contradicts the other. Once you've got a hang of this, then you don't get tested.
It sounds a lot like the answer to how do you get rid of doubt before it starts. How do you get rid of bad momentum before it starts?
So we would say you get rid of doubt by recognizing just conceptually there's satisfaction or there's doubt. I prefer satisfaction. There's satisfaction or there's anger. I prefer satisfaction. Practice it conceptually, and then when doubt comes, you may be able, because you've practiced it enough, to say, well, I prefer satisfaction. And maybe you can click over into something that feels satisfying if you've practiced it conceptually before you're faced with it. Most of all, don't make it hard.
The purpose of my question was that I've tried to make a practice of meditating every morning.
Yeah.
I've tried to make a practice of being appreciative. And I've reached a frustration point with the negative momentum that's building during the day. And so I'm looking to not work so hard at what seems to be not working.
Well, we think this conversation about right in the middle of the emotional scale is satisfaction and dissatisfaction, and that by recognizing, isolating the difference, that you'll catch a feeling of dissatisfaction earlier on. And if you don't worry, it will get bigger. And if it gets bigger, don't worry, it's meaningful. If something bigger happens, don't worry, it's meaningful. So we're going to tell a story. It's about people in this room who work with Jerry and Esther. And Esther asked us not to tell this story earlier, but now she's realizing that it's the perfect story to tell. And so we're going to tell you this story because Esther had one of the greatest, most meaningful, life-changing, understanding experiences from it. And so because it was so meaningful to her, we're going to tell it to you. A few weeks ago, after the seminar, these wonderful people that travel with Esther were taking the room apart and doing what they do. In other words, think about it. How often they're flying or driving, carrying all the things, setting them all up week after week. In other words, it's a lot of goings on to get ready for you. And so in the process of breaking down in some city, they forgot to pack one of the screens, just left it in the room. In a place where they could not see it. They're surmising that it's a black screen and it was sitting on black chairs, and they just didn't see it, and they didn't realize that they didn't have it until they got to the next city and were unloading and setting up, and they only had one screen. And so fortunately, because things are always working out, the people in the room next to them had some screens. They were able to borrow the screens, and so there was really nothing to even think about, because things are always working out, unless you are inclined to point at wrongdoing. It was certainly not the right thing to leave the screen, but it wasn't such a wrong thing to leave the screen either, was it? So when Esther heard about it, she laughed about it, and then they were on a sort of group thread about it. Now, Esther happened to be in the city where the screen was left, and so now there was a little bit of trying to figure out what to do with that great big screen. It wouldn't even fit in anybody's car, pretty long. And so as Esther got focused more on it, and none of it was left for her to do, just for her to think about, the screen being left took on a bigger life of its own. It was like something that seemed pretty simple now was seeming less simple. And so she thought to herself, in fact, she talked to us about it, and she thought, why is this bothering me? And then she thought, well, it's bothering me because we need the screen somewhere else. And she couldn't understand why it bothered her. And then she thought, I think it's bothering me because it doesn't seem to be bothering them. They were doing what Abraham does. They were being lied about it. They were making the best of it. And Esther was not making the best of it. Esther was thinking, so she sent a note to all of them. I would like you all to get together and decide who's going to be responsible for checking the room and getting stuff on the truck. See where she was pointed? Yeah? So, long story short, screen got gathered up, got shipped to the new city. Here it is, ta-da. But then, the person, John, that Esther held most responsible for getting the screen, he drives a truck, sent a text that said, having some acceleration problems with the van. Now that's a big problem, because the van's got all the stuff, and the stuff's got to go from place to place. So see how it got a little bit bigger? And then, after some figuring it out, he discovered at the dealership that he had put gasoline in a diesel engine. It's all right, John. And Esther thought, of course he did. Of course he did. That's where I was pointing. He didn't have any other option. He was in my power. I was pointing, and of course he felt terrible, and I was pointing, and of course he doesn't want to make mistakes, and I was pointing, and of course, Esther said, I have some responsibility in where I point, and therefore some responsibility in what I influence. You see what we're getting at? You just can't work together as humanity or as people on a team and point anywhere without where you're pointing being part of the mix. Especially when you have powerful thoughts and powerful minds, and especially when you want more than life itself to understand how this all works. And when Esther realized what had happened, she felt relief beyond any relief that she's ever felt, because it let her understand unequivocally the part that she plays in anything that happens that she has done any pointing whatsoever about. When you point at anything, you are a part of the outcome that comes next, you see.